Hello, today we're going to start our introduction of the muscular system. So what do the muscles do? They move bones for one thing. We've learned about the skeletal system, and so muscles contract and they allow us to move our bones. They help us maintain our posture and body position. They help stabilize our joints. They also generate heat, especially your skeletal muscles. So when skeletal muscle contracts, it generates heat. When you shiver, your skeletal muscles are contracting really quickly, and that causes you to shiver so you can warm up. And they move things like fluids like blood and food and things like that. So we'll talk about the different types of muscle and what they do. There are three types of muscle tissues, and the first one we'll talk about is skeletal muscle. And this is what we're going to spend the most time on in this unit. But skeletal muscle, as the name implies, moves bones. It's attached to the bones. It's also attached to your skin, so expression, you can make expressions with skeletal muscle. It's striated, so if you look at a microscope and look at the histology, you can see it has these little stripes, little striations. Okay. It's voluntary. That means we're in control. I can tell my arm to move or blink my eyes. Anything that is skeletal muscle, I'm in control of. It's very powerful. These are large, can be very large muscles, very strong muscles. Each muscle has one artery, one nerve, and at least one vein, usually more than one vein. The second type of muscle is cardiac muscle, and this is the muscle that makes up your heart, and this is the muscle that moves blood. And it's only in the heart. It's also striated, and we'll talk about what these striations are, but it's involuntary. You don't have to think or remember to beat your heart. It does it on its own. Cardiac muscle is also branched. Okay, so skeletal muscle, all the muscles kind of line up in a line, and cardiac muscle has these branchings. They also have these things called intercalated discs, and when we get into the heart in chapter 18 or in your second anatomy, you'll learn more about the importance of the striations and the intercalated discs in that class. But they do look different histologically. Skeletal muscle are straight muscle cells, muscle fibers in a line, and cardiac muscle is more branched. The third type of muscle is smooth muscle, and this is the muscle that lines tubes. You'll find it in hollow organs like your stomach, your urinary bladder. It's not striated, there's no stripes. It's also involuntary, so you don't have to tell your body to do this. These muscles act on their own. And we'll learn more about these muscles in later chapters. Muscle has special characteristics. It's excitable, that's the first one, which means it can receive and respond to a stimulus. And in the case of skeletal muscle, we're going to focus on the action potential. Now, we haven't covered this yet, but we're going to talk about what an action potential is. But that's the stimulus that causes a skeletal muscle to contract. Muscle has contractility. That means it's able to shorten when it's stimulated and then to relax. It has extensibility. That means it can be stretched. And elasticity, which means it's able to go back to its original length, so it can recoil. So those are the four special characteristics of muscle. Okay, so let's talk about the anatomy of what a muscle looks like. And this is the femur. You should remember that from your last unit. And you can see that the muscles will attach to the bone using a tendon. And there's some other connections as well, but we're going to talk about, in this example, you have a tendon. Remember, ligaments connect bone to bone, and tendons connect muscle to bone. So we have a tendon, and this whole thing is a muscle. And a muscle is separated from the rest of the body. It's basically surrounded or has a covering called an epimysium. Anytime you see MYO or MY or that kind of my type of a prefix, that means muscle. So epimysium, so epi means upon or on, is upon the muscle. This is the outside covering of the muscle. Well, each muscle is then subdivided into these smaller units, and these are called fascicles. And each fascicle, so this would be a fascicle, and each fascicle is surrounded by something called a perimysium, also a piece of connective tissue that wraps around the fascicle. And then each fascicle is made up of a bunch of these muscle fibers or muscle cells. Okay, and then you have an endomysium, which are between these muscle fibers. So in muscle anatomy, muscle fibers and muscle cells are the same thing. So you have your fascicle, which are these bunches of muscle fibers, Okay, in between each muscle fiber you have an endomysium, and then around the entire muscle you have an epimysium. So you'll need to recognize these three terms, epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium, and where you'd expect to find them. Now, how do those muscles attach to the bone? Well, you can attach them directly or indirectly. And if it's directly, then that epimysium of the muscle is going to fuse with the periosteum of the bone. So that's a direct connection. So hopefully you remember the periosteum, which is that covering of the bone. The epimysium and the perimysium fuse and join the bone and muscle together directly. You can also have an indirect connection where the connective tissues kind of make a long rope-like tissue, for like example, a tendon. And there's also something called an aponeurosis, and we're going to talk about an aponeurosis when we show you the different muscles and where you can expect to find those as well. So let's kind of look at the muscle, and then let's kind of go down. We're going to talk about the smaller and smaller parts. So just as a reminder, you have your big muscle, okay, surrounded by an epimysium. You can take out one bundle or fascicle. Each fascicle is surrounded by a perimysium. We can take out one muscle fiber, which is a muscle cell, and it is surrounded by a endomysium. Okay. Another thing I want you, and these little stripes, these are the striations. Okay, so you can see those little stripes on these muscle fibers or muscle cells. Each muscle cell has a smaller component called a myofibril. So muscle cells are made up of bundles of myofibrils. You'll also notice that muscle cells have more than one nuclei. Okay, they're multinucleate. So whereas a lot of cells have one nucleus, muscle cells have many, and we'll talk about why that is later on. They also have these little orange things, lots and lots of mitochondria. So if you think back to your first unit, what the nucleus and what the mitochondria do, the mitochondria make energy, and muscles are big users of energy, big ATP users. So you want lots of mitochondria to make lots of ATP. So some terms, you can look in your book. You'll need to be able to define these terms because I'm going to use them in your test questions, and plus I want you to know what they are. So the terms to know when you talk about a skeletal muscle fiber, remember skeletal muscle fiber is a skeletal muscle cell. And so we want to look at all the particular smaller parts of a muscle cell. So if you think back to the first unit, we had a typical cell, and we had a nucleus, and we had an endoplasmic reticulum, and we had little mitochondria, and we had a Golgi body and smoothie arch. Well, we have the same types of parts, organelles, in this cell, but we give some of them a different name, and they have a different function. So again, we have a nucleus, and we have lots and lots of nuclei, more than one. We have these myofibrils, which are parts of the cell, have lots and lots of mitochondria. We have the sarcolemma, which is what we call the cell membrane of a muscle cell. Sarco is another word, like myo means muscle. Sarco also has to do with muscle. So if you see the word sarco, it's always going to be in relation to something muscle. You have a sarcoplasm, so instead of calling it the cytoplasm of the muscle cell, you call it the sarcoplasm. Instead of saying endoplasmic reticulum, you say sarcoplasmic reticulum. Again, you have the myofibrils, and these myofibrils have something even smaller in them called actin and myosin, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You have what are called transverse tubules or T-tubules, which are these things here. And then you have what's called a terminal cisternae. And so again, you can look at your book and look at these terms and kind of learn how to define those. We're going to use these terms as we move through muscle physiology, but I'm just introducing them to you now, but you'll hear them and see them again. Okay, so we have, we're going to break this down and kind of look more and more at the smaller and smaller microanatomy. So we're going to take one muscle fiber, one muscle cell, and we're going to pull out a myofibril. And this is a myofibril. And what we want to do is we want to look at what's called the functional unit of a muscle fiber, which is the sarcomere. And the sarcomere is actually the functional unit of the muscle. And a sarcomere, if you take an imaginary line, there's something called a Z-disc from here to here. This is a sarcomere, okay? And so this is what actually moves and causes the muscle fiber and then eventually the muscle to shorten. You have what are called thin filaments, which have actin in them, and then you have thick filaments, which have myosin in them. And this actin and myosin, they actually stick together and kind of ratchet against each other and cause the sarcomere to shorten. So if this sarcomere shortens and this sarcomere shortens and this sarcomere shortens, so like if this one shortens and then this one shortens and this shortens, all at the same time, that whole muscle cell will shorten. And we're going to talk about exactly how that happens. And there's several little videos that you get to watch that kind of animate how this all works. I really wish I had had these animations when I was in school. I had to kind of imagine it in my head. So you guys have it a little bit easier getting to watch an animated version of how this actually works. So just to kind of go a little bit bigger and show you a little bit more, we're going to take that sarcomere, and you're going to see that you've got actin, which is actually almost like a double-stranded pearl necklace. Okay, so it's basically a set of twisted beads here and here. And then the myosin, it almost looks like a bunch of golf clubs that have been kind of wrapped together, and you have these little heads that stick out. And those heads will actually connect to the actin, and they'll do like this. They'll cock, and they'll ratchet those actin filaments, those thin filaments, toward the middle. And as they do that, these Z discs come closer and closer and closer together, and the sarcomere shortens. And we're going to talk, like I said, we'll do more physiology of how that actually works. Today we're just going to learn some terms. So let's take the sarcomere and blow it up and see some more detail. So this would be the sarcomere. And we have thick filaments and thin filaments. So these are going to be some vocabulary words that you're going to need to learn for this unit. So the thick filament is made up of the myosin. And so myosin, it looks like a golf club. You have a tail region and a flexible hinge region, and then a head, and this is where the actin can bind. So actin and myosin can actually bind together, and the myosin actually moves, grabs that actin, and causes the sarcomere to shorten. So you have a thick filament made up of myosin molecules, and each myosin molecule has a tail region, a hinge region, a head region with an actin binding site. The thin filament is made up of actin, and it also has troponin and tropomyosin. So the actin are these like double-stranded pearl necklaces, and so these little blue beads. So this is the actin, and so these actin molecules all line up together and kind of form this double-stranded necklace-looking structure. And associated with that is troponin and tropomyosin. And troponin actually has a calcium binding site, and so that's going to be real important later on. So calcium binds troponin, and when that happens, it actually causes tropomyosin. If you'll notice, the tropomyosin is covering over these little holes on the actin. Those are the myosin binding sites. So when calcium binds troponin, that causes the tropomyosin to move and expose these binding sites so the actin and myosin can get together. We're going to go over all of this. We got some videos for you guys to watch so that you can actually see it in action and see it animated. So you'll get it. Don't worry. Don't worry yet. So what we're going to do in the coming videos is we're going to actually walk you through step by step on how a muscle contracts. And there's a bunch of steps. We're going to start all the way from the nervous system to where the nervous system and the muscle come together, to how you send an action potential, which is the stimulus throughout the muscle, and the individual steps that actually cause that sarcomere to do some stuff and to shorten, and the actual muscle to shorten. Lots and lots of fun coming your way. So we're going to talk about activation, which is basically the nervous system stimulating the muscle. We're going to talk about something called excitation contraction coupling, and we're going to talk about the sliding filament theory. Okay, so these are all coming in your next couple of videos. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video.